Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Here on this channel, we try to bring you actual history that you can't find on TV. And some of the best history is found in very old books. So that's what we like to read on this program. And today we're going to read from another old book called Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarker, published around 1838. And so this story today is, to me, a very interesting one. It's entitled A Comanche Princess. And so it's going to be, it's not like a battle or anything like that. It's going to be something a little bit different. So I think you'll enjoy this one. The following interesting narrative from General H.P.B., which appeared some years ago in the American Sketchbook, edited by Mrs. Bella French Swisher of Austin, Texas, will no doubt be of interest to the reader, and we therefore reproduce it here. In the spring of 1843, the Republic of Texas, Sam Houston being president, dispatched Colonel J.C. Eldridge, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and Mr. Tom Torrey, Indian agents, to visit the several wild tribes on the frontier of Texas, and induce them to make peace and conclude treaties with the Republic. General H.P.B. accompanied the expedition, but in no official capacity. A recent conversation with him disclosed to us the following touching scene as one of the many incidents of that perilous and adventurous trip. At the house of a frontier settler near where the town of Marlin, Texas now stands, the commissioners received two Comanche children who had been captured by Colonel Moore, a famous and valiant soldier of the old Republic in one of his forays on the upper waters of the Colorado in 1840. These children had been ordered to be returned to their people. One of them was a boy of 14 years old named Bill Hockley, in honor of the veteran Colonel Hockley, then high in command of the Army of the Republic, who had adopted the boy and taken care of him. The other was a girl 11 years old named Maria. The parting of the little girl from the good people who had evidently been kind to her was very affecting. She cried bitterly and begged that she would not be carried away. She had forgotten her native language, spoke only our language, and had the same dread of an Indian that any of the white children had. Her little nature had been cultivated by the hand of civilization until it drooped at the thought of the rough Indian life, as a delicately nurtured flower will droop in the strong winds of the prairies. There being no excuse, however, for retaining her among the white people, a pretty, gentle Indian pony with a little side saddle was procured for her, and she was taken from her friends. On arriving at a camp in Tanacone, above where the town of Waco now is located, the party met the first Indians, a mixture of Delawares, Wacos, etc. The appearance of the little girl on horseback created great amusement among the Indians. She was so shy and timid, and the very manner in which she was seated on the side saddle was different from that of the brown-skinned woman of her race. The next morning after the arrival at the camp, Bill Hockley came out in full Indian costume, having exchanged his citizen cloths for buckskin jacket, pants, etc. He at once resumed his Indian habits, and from that day during the long trip of months, Bill was noticed as the keenest eye of the party. He could tell an object at a greater distance, a horse from a buffalo, a horse without a rider, etc., quicker than an Indian at camp. The journey proceeded with its varied scenes of excitement, danger, and interest for 4 months, and the barometer of the party was the little Comanche princess. The object of the expedition was to see the head chief of the Comanches, and of course, as the search was to be made in the boundless prairies, it was no easy or certain task. Yet they could tell the distance from or proximity to the Comanches by the conduct of the little girl. When news would come that the Indians were near, the childish voice would not be heard in its joyous freshness, caroling around the fire. But when news arrived that they would not be found, her spirits would revive, and her joy would show itself in gambols as merry as those of the innocent fawn that sports around its mother on the green bosom of the prairie. At last the goal was reached, and the party was in the Comanche camp, the village of Paihahuco, the head chief of all the Comanches. Maria's time had come, but the little girl tried to avoid notice and kept as close as possible. Her appearance, however, was the cause of great sensation, and a few days fixed the fact that she was the daughter of the former head chief of the nation, who died on the forks of the Brazos from wounds received at the Battle of Plum Creek back in 1840. Thus, unknown to her or themselves, they had been associating with a royal princess, Nosa Kuiyash, the long-lost and beloved child of the nation. This extraordinarily good luck for the little girl brought no assuagement for her grief. Her joy was gone. She spoke not a word of Comanche and could not reciprocate the warm greeting she received. On arriving at the village, Bill Hockley determined that he would not talk Comanche, although he spoke it perfectly well, not having, like Maria, forgotten his native language. During the week they remained in the village, Bill, contrary to his usual custom, kept close to the party and did not speak a word to those around him, nor could he be induced to do so. On one occasion, a woman brought a roasting ear, which is of great value in her eyes, as it had come probably 150 miles, and presented it to Bill, who sat in one of the tents. The boy gave not the slightest attention to the woman or her gifts, but kept his eyes fixed on the ground. Finally, she put the roasting ear under his eyes, so that as he looked down, he must see it. Then, talking all the time, she walked off and watched him. But Bill, from under his eyes, noted her movements, and not until she was out of sight did he get up and say, "That ugly old woman is not Mammy, but I will eat her roasting ear." When the chief came home, he was absent for several days after the party arrived. He asked to see the children, and they were then presented, and he spoke to Bill in a peremptory tone of voice, and Bill at once answered, being the first word of Comanche he had spoken since his arrival. This broke the ice, and the boy went among his people, not returning to his white friends until he was wanted to take part in the ceremony of being finally delivered over to his tribe, and afterward never going to tell them goodbye. So there and then Bill Hockley passed from the scene. The day before the grand council with the Comanches, the skill and ingenuity of the party of the three white men were taxed to its fullest extent to make a suitable dress for the Comanche princess, whose clothes, it may be supposed, had become old and shabby. Their lady friends would have been vastly amused at their efforts. There was no pullback, to be sure. Whether the body was too long or too short we are unable to say, but it was one or the other. The skirt was a success, but the sleeves would not work, so they cut them off at the elbow. The next morning they dressed the little princess in a flaming red calico dress, put strings of brass beads on her neck, brass rings on her arms, a wealth of prairie flowers on her head, tied a red ribbon around her smooth, nicely plaited hair, and painted her face with vermilion until she looked like the real princess that she was. All this, however, was no pleasure to poor Maria. She was like a lamb dressed in flowers for the sacrifice. Finally, the time came when in the full council Colonel Eldridge stood holding the hands of the two children in front of the chief, and said to him that as evidence of the desire of the great white father, Sam Houston, to make peace and be friendly with the great Comanche nation, he had sent them two children, captives in war, back to their people. After these words he attempted to place the hands of both in the extended hand of the chief, but at that moment the most distressing screams burst from Maria. She ran behind Colonel Eldridge and begged him for God's sake not to give her to those people, to have mercy, and not to leave her. Then the poor child fell on her knees and shrieked, and clung to him with all madness of despair. A death-like silence prevailed in the council. The Indians stood by in stern stoicism. The voices of the white men were silent with emotion, and nothing but the cries of the poor lamb of sacrifice pierced the distance of the bloom-scented prairies. Her white friends as soon as possible attempted to quiet the child. Of course, the comforting words were spoken in their own language, but they were evidently understood by all, for theirs was the language of nature. Finding their efforts useless, the chief said, "This is the child of our long-mourned chief. She is of our blood. Her aged grandmother stands ready to receive her, but she has forgotten her people. She does not want to come to us, and if the great white chief only sent her for us to see that she is fat and well taken care of, tell him I thank him, and she can go back." This was an opportunity, and General B suggested to Colonel Eldridge that he should save the child. But although the latter's heart was bursting with grief and sympathy, his sense of duty told him his work was unfinished, and he replied to the chief, "I have been ordered to give you this child. I have done so, and it is my duty to see it fulfilled. But you see that she is no longer a Comanche. Child in years when she was taken from you by the stern hand of war, she has learned the language of another people, and I implore you to give her to me and let me take her home and care for her all the days of my life." "No," said the chief. "If she is my child, I will keep her." He swung her roughly behind him into the arms of the old grandmother, who bore her, screaming, from the council tent. And thus the princess was delivered to her people, but the last sound the party heard on leaving that Comanche camp was the wail of the poor, desolate child. Years after, General B received a message from Maria and sent her a few presents by way of remembrance. She had become the main interpreter of her nation and often met our people in council. So it ended well at last. She became an instrument of good and fulfilled her destiny on the stage of action for which she was born. But the remembrance of the bright but desolate child and her prayers and tears when she was forced to be left with her stranger people is fresh in the memory of at least one of the party and will last him through life. We presume the princess was captured in the fight by Colonel Moore on the Red Fork of the Colorado, related elsewhere in this book. So that's it for this story right here. So as you can see, it was a really interesting story, kind of the opposite of what happened with Cynthia Parker. She was a white girl captured by Indians in 1836 and then eventually recaptured, and she figured out that she didn't want to go back. She wanted to stay with the Comanches. In this case, this was a Comanche girl captured, and she had been with white people for about 3 years, and then she really didn't want to go back, but eventually she became an interpreter for the Comanches and did a lot of good in that capacity. So that's it for this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.